So the next bit is where you guys all come in. So we're going to have a roundtable discussion, and we're going to divide the room in two sections. So that half of the room is going to discuss governance, and that half of the room is going to discuss the challenge of finance.
For that grant funding, and I think sometimes the grant funding is short-sighted.
How do I find them? How do I convince them? How do I manage them? In a situation wherever the funding is good, no longer comes up
because we are leading the market. There's no competitors.
So we're going to hear from all the tables if we have enough time. So I'm going to ask the people who report back to focus on the highlights and the main points. So I want to start with the table in the back. That's it. Miriam, are you going to report back?
Okay. We had a discussion and we could have discussed a bit more as well. It was really interesting. So what we were talking about is very much how you can deal with challenges of who you actually have on the board and how you deal with. We had an example here telling about a change of board members that was really challenging for the organization, and also then the process afterwards of thinking about, okay, who do you want to have on the board, and are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? Are they aware of what you expect from them? Do they use the meetings to actually benefit the organization? We also talked about that it's important to identify gaps in the board. So what would actually help to develop the organization further? What do you need in terms of starting new activities, for example? Then, yeah, we also discussed about that. Mainly I think it was about who are the right people and how you really get the board to do what they're supposed to do and benefit the organization, and also that oftentimes you have members that are very qualified and would be very good, but then exactly those members are maybe very busy and they cannot invest so much in the organization. So we didn't really find a solution for that, but I think communicating what comes with this job is very, very important. Do you want to say anything else today?
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Going to Alex, second table.
Okay, this will be a marathon. So basically we started from a concrete example of an organization that is dealing with a concrete situation. They started with a board that was based mostly on personal relationships with the board members, and now they're in this transition phase towards a new board. And how can this be acquired? And then the roundtable discussion revolved around potential solutions for this. We had a nice metaphor again from Hungary with this relationship between the CEO and the board being the pilot and the control tower for the organization. We discussed about how the size of the organization is important in what the board's role is, and how the organization can use the board. We also had an example of an organization that had a two boards model, so an official board that was a result also of the legal requirements in that particular country, in the UK in this case, but also a board focused on beneficiaries to get the input from the organization itself and to translate it in official affairs. The issue of actual engagement of board members was brought up, and the fact that this turnover of board members over time might be important because people have different interests and different levels of engagement in the organization over time. And we try to wrap up with emphasizing that there is sometimes a difference between what the legal requirement in regards to a board is and what happens legally speaking, and how legally speaking the board is liable for particular things versus what actually happens in the organization, when the board meetings can be basically informal meetings that the organization doesn't even realize that are board meetings. And this is also something to have in mind.
Thank you. That was a lot and very interesting. Well done. Next table, please.
Yeah, so we had similar challenges. We started with how does a new social enterprise find a board, and has been given the advice to seek out friends and families, but that might be quite challenging, especially when we consider the next challenge, which was how do you manage out a non-functioning board, which also happened. And then we discussed 4, I thought, quite nice practical issues. So how do you get a board? Well, there's social capital, but also social capital in terms seek out peers. We heard from a bank that actually facilitates connections, but there are also meeting places for social entrepreneurs. But that also leads to a challenge of interlocking boards. So there's a limited number of board members available essentially in the region, and they then happen to be on the boards of related social enterprises, which then led on to how do we get new board members. And Simon shared the board apprenticeship scheme, I would call it. So how do you train up new young individuals who are keen to actually help out? Because to be nominated for a board, you have to have board experience. So this is kind of a vicious cycle that you have to break. And to enhance the professionality of the board, there was a consensus, I would dare to say, that clear job descriptions help for board members, that you need to balance passion with competence. So it's great to have lots of passion for the social mission, but the business competence can also help. And we are back to the idea of board diversity. So diverse boards with diverse complementary competences are good. And then the last point was about how can you avoid that the board becomes disconnected from the social enterprise, from the beneficiaries, that it appears distant to those in the organization, and vice versa, that the board actually doesn't get a sense of the organization. And there was a very practical recommendation of meet the board kind of sessions for the organization where the employees and the beneficiaries actually can speak to the board, which helps both sides to build greater understanding.
So I think that our discussion, I think, had maybe 2 themes. One was talking a little about the power dynamics between funders and the social enterprises, and I think the other was one that was talked about a little bit this morning, which is the different languages of the funders and the entrepreneurs. And in terms of the power dynamics, I think there were maybe two things. One was in terms of the balance on the issues. A lot of times the funders have a little bit more power, so the funders are able to push what's important to them. And Natasha was saying that it's really important that the social entrepreneur needs to stand up for their own issues and needs to make sure that their view also gets a voice in these discussions. On the other side of the things is about numbers and targets. And Robin pointed out that especially with grant funders, a lot of times they're really interested in setting these kind of KPI and these targets. But the problem is that a lot of times these targets have to be set before the program is even launched. And a lot of times when these are new programs, when these are innovations, you don't necessarily have any idea what to expect. So you sometimes are setting targets that then you realize, once you enter the new market, that maybe these weren't realistic. And we were talking about how do we go back to funders and deal with that, and some suggestions were that transparency is really important. And another strategy that works well is pointing out that this is a new market, and right now we're the kind of leader in this market. So yes, we encounter this problem, but anybody else who is in this thing would also encounter this problem. So if you want to tackle this problem, we need to work together and find a solution to this. You can't go to somebody else and expect that this problem will disappear. And then the other thing in talking about the language, it was kind of interesting because, so the social entrepreneurs come from a lot of different backgrounds. Sometimes they're people with maybe more of a social nonprofit background, sometimes a public sector background, sometimes an academic background, sometimes a business background. So a lot of times we talk about how it's difficult for social entrepreneurs to talk with private investors. But it was kind of interesting because Robin said that First Respond's entire management team have MBAs. And so for them, it's actually talking with the private investors is, it's quite easy, and they're comfortable with them, and they know how to get their social values in and help the private investors feel comfortable with the business side of things, but also understand the social values. But for them, actually, it took them a while to learn about the different types of stories that the nonprofit, that the grant funders were interested, because he said that all types of funders want a story. The private investors want, the story of why this is different from their other purely commercial investments. And the grant funders also want stories, but the stories are a little bit different. And for people of all backgrounds, it's kind of learning how to, tell the different stories.
Thanks, Austin. I'm going to move over to the table in the back where Anna is going to give a summary.
Okay, so we started off talking about the issues tension between the mission and strings that can be attached to finance, and again picked up on the issue of communication and the importance of choosing funding with there being matching expectations on both sides. And then we kind of moved into the issue of legal structures and how legal structures, the choices you make there, can have implications on future financing, and this being something that social entrepreneurs are not necessarily aware of at the time. And so Hannah from Unlimited was saying that this is one of the pieces of advice that they really appreciate, really finding out what legal structures are out there, what impact that will have on their future. We also then talked about the fact that, for instance, in the UK, the role of intermediaries in financing for helping this communication between the social enterprises and the investors. And then Hannah was just saying at the end about how Unlimited is trying to influence policy so that we don't have this tension between certain legal forms not being able to access grant funding, and how this is an issue, because obviously if you in the future having the ability to have shares allows for growth, but there's this mismatch in the middle again between when you're getting from the grant funding to shares. So that was our discussion.
Thank you. That was really a bridge between governance and finance. That was really good. Thanks. So moving to the table in the corner, Orsi.
So we had a very diverse team, and those who were coming from the social enterprise sector, they could very well relate to the challenges that we saw from the presentation. And it came up how much effort it is from the staff to engage in this fundraising process, which is, to be honest, not the sexiest in the organization. And also, if you're not paid as a commercial business, it's especially not something you are very well prepared to do. It came up that it's very important to set up the outcomes, the expected outcomes for yourself and not for the funders, because it can really shift your focus on the long run. Then we were talking about funding coming from the government or from the private sector. And the challenges with government funding is the rules that are up for you. So you really have to stick to the rules, and you're not allowed to do certain things which you would like to do otherwise. And there's, of course, a lot of administration connected to these government fundings. On the other hand, when you get funding from the private sector, very often companies see it as part of their social responsibility. And it's obviously an opportunity, but as well as a challenge. And if it's simply just a social responsibility project, which they have, very often they don't care so much about the organization or what you do, but they would like to use the name of your organization and the fancy pictures.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. Last table, Chloe?
Yeah, sure. I'm impressed with all the comments. So, of course, we had all this discussion, but we also come up with, it's about research, right? The new wording. So our conclusion at the table was that something is missing, and we agree, I think. So it's about not just the early stage, because I think Unlimited is doing a lot, but when you need to grow a little bit. You're not that big, but you're not super big. You just want to grow. So we suggest that it should be created a community venture capital. Okay, that's...
Wow, innovation happening right here. It's very good.